Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking episode 8 of The Flash called Flash vs. Arrow. And guys, I gotta tell you, this is one ever since they announced it that I have just been waiting for with bated breath. This to me is kind of sort of a landmark in live action superheroes. And I gotta say, this is, I think, everything we really could have asked for. If Batman versus Superman is half as good as this episode, I think a lot of us are going to be able to walk out of that theater feeling very satisfied. And this is just so much of what is fun about those stories that they have in the comics, where superheroes end up fighting each other. And what's really great is just the contrast where they put, having the Flash gang and the Arrow gang all in the same episode, and just seeing them bounce off of each other and having all these really fun and interesting little moments, great little character interactions. I mean, there is just so much to talk about. So let's just kind of get right into things. So the bad guy in this episode, let's kind of get the smaller stuff out of the way, is Roy G. Bivolo. And note that Roy G. Biv, the famous little trick for remembering the colors of the rainbow. Now, his counterpart in the comics is classically known as a bad guy called, I kid you not, the Rainbow Raider. And Rainbow Raider's costume sort of looks like if somebody said, okay, let's take the gay pride flag, use that as the basis for a supervillain costume, add in some black and some goggles, and bam. So, yeah, I mean, it's very hard to take a guy who incorporates a rainbow into his supervillain costume terribly seriously. And the Rainbow Raider has generally been portrayed as kind of a joke villain, somebody who considers himself the Flash's greatest enemy, when really he's just an annoyance. The only time, in fact, the story I can even remember that had the Rainbow Raider in it that I actually liked was the Underworld Unleashed miniseries that DC did many years ago. And his whole thing in that story was really to be basically amounted to the Rainbow Raider is a fool and a joke that nobody cares about. I mean, yeah, I mean that's a good story, and seeing the whole thing with Raider just sort of realizing that he's been had so badly is pretty funny. But that's really about all he has to do there. Now, in the show, Cisco dubs him Chroma, not to be confused with Green Lantern villain Corona, which is also the name of a shitty brand of Mexican beer. But Caitlin, of course, is the one who. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. No. Chroma is the name this character has in. Sorry, I think I had a hair in my mouth or something. In the New 52 comics, Cisco actually dubs him Prism, which I think is a much more fitting name. And Caitlin is the one who sort of throws out the name Rainbow Raider, and then Cisco kind of snaps back and like, yeah, leave coming up with the code names for these guys to me. So Rainbow Raider as a name did get mentioned. It's sort of silly because it comes from Caitlin, and she's not very good at coming up with these sort of names. So that, again, it's a nice way to sort of incorporate that nod to the fans of the comics, but also having a nice little character moment there. And of course, Raider is just a plot device in this episode to make Oliver and Barry get into a fight. He has no real depth as a character, and frankly, under most circumstances, I'd complain about that. But here, it doesn't matter. It works just fine. He's a plot device, and this is basically how you use characters as nothing more than a plot device, and have it be okay. In fact, the only thing that people I've really seen mentioning much about him is that he looks an awful lot like Robin Lord Taylor, who plays Penguin over on Gotham, and I can't lie, that also went through my mind while I was watching this episode. Sorry, I just got a text on my phone. I'm trying to glance and see if it was anything important, which of course it isn't. So let's see here. That's it out of the way. So let's kind of move on to some of the other stuff with the characters, and let's sort of start small and work our way up. Cisco, we've talked about him a bit, and again, not a huge amount to say about him this episode. Just that we really get to see Cisco geeking out hard this episode. He's obviously very pumped that Arrow is in town. He gets super, super excited when he gets to check out Captain Boomerang's boomerang. I did forget to mention Captain Boomerang in my Arrow review last week, so sorry about that. But we'll, of course, talk about him plenty when I review tonight's episode of Arrow, which will go up, of course, tomorrow morning. And of course, we get to see him and Digg sort of get into the sort of comic book debate about who would win in a fight between the superheroes. And I love when they're doing it. After they're like, "No, Flash is gonna win, Arrow's gonna win," and then Felicity just sort of says, "I can't believe we're actually having this argument." Again, just sort of being a little bit of meta commentary on just sort of how ridiculous it is when comic book fans do sort of get into these debates, because, well, they really do accomplish nothing, but it can be quite a bit of fun. One just has to keep in mind, debating who wins in the fight between Captain America or Batman. Actually, this was settled in the comics. Captain America won. Or, the Superman versus Goku thing. The answer is Superman and Goku wouldn't fight. They would both realize that they're both really good people and would probably become very close friends. So, yeah. We also get to see Cisco continuing his habit of making rather inappropriate comments around pretty ladies. Cisco is a guy who Cisco needs a girlfriend. Let's just be blunt about that. We also got to see some really nice stuff with Caitlin and her bonding with Felicity. And I gotta say, I really do like these two characters together. They really bounce off each other well. Science sisters. And of course, Felicity ends up. I mean, the girls even remark on it's like, how nice it is to sort of just be able to be nerdy, smart girls together. Yeah, sort of get away from that male energy a little bit. And then, excuse me, Felicity asks for Caitlin's help in doing a DNA analysis on some of the evidence from Sarah's murder. Not really sure why Felicity couldn't have had that done, at a private lab or something like that. But I guess handing something like that off to somebody who she knows will keep it under their hat probably makes more sense. Let's see, what else? Let's kind of wrap things up with the Star Labs crew and bring us to Harrison Wells. And of course, we get to have our obligatory Harrison Wells' sinister moment when he tries to wriggle the Arrow's identity out of Felicity, and of course she immediately shuts him down. And I really don't think Wells was expecting her to do that. I think he was just sort of testing Felicity, seeing if, if I put a little bit of pressure on her, what happens? And of course Felicity doesn't go for that, and he just sort of says like, I'll figure it out myself. And of course he figures it out. Now, most likely he either already knew this, just because of his knowledge of the future, or he went to, Gideon, that AI he has, and said, "Hey Gideon, who is the Arrow?" And of course he also has a perfectly reasonable explanation for how he figured that out, given that Barry was seen hanging out in public with Oliver Queen. I mean, Iris even saw them and gushed about it. So if anybody ever asks, like, "Hey, how did you figure out that, Oliver Queen was the Arrow?" It's like, Barry, you went and had coffee with him. Felicity Smoke used to work for Oliver Queen, and we know that she works for the Arrow. So I mean, it's really, really very easy to see in universe how the characters, Dr. Wells, would be able to pass that off. You also got to see him team up with Joe this episode to sort of come down against the idea of Oliver and Barry hanging out and being buds. And again, I did like that Joe raises a really reasonable point. I mean, Oliver has killed a shitload of people back in season 1, and he never answered for it. Now, granted, they were, bad guys, crime bosses, and, the muscle that worked for them and people like that. And, Barry even specifically kind of brought that up, and Joe said, well, how do you think the families of those people are going to feel? Which is something I myself have mentioned. And they even, Barry tries to say, like, hey, even the Starling City cops aren't chasing the Arrow anymore. And, he's changed. He's not like that anymore. And again, Joe sort of shuts him down on that one at every turn. And again, Joe is raising a not unreasonable point here. But what I like is that by the end of the episode, after Oliver has saved Barry and all this, Joe kind of, I think, understands where the Starling City cops are. That, Oliver is somebody who is willing to go out there and put his life on the line, risk his life in order to save someone. And given that it's basically his adopted son, I think that earns Oliver quite a bit of slack in Joe's book. Now, again, Oliver is still sort of on the hook for killing. What was it? Remember that scene with Quentin Lance and Roy showing him the dead body of one of those guys killed? And I think Lance said, "We call this guy number 27." Now stop and think about that. That means Oliver is responsible, according to the police, for more than 24 murders. And somebody actually ran the math on how many people Oliver killed in season 1. It's something like just shy of 60. So, I don't know, I guess the cops sort of figured, I guess only like about not even half these guys were for sure killed by the arrow-wielding vigilante who's been running around town murdering criminals for months. But yeah, these other guys, we're totally 100% sure that he did that. But, again, details. Moving on. This episode, it's kind of interesting that people have pointed out that over in Starling City, Oliver has killed a whole bunch of people, and all kinds of hell has broken loose in Starling since he came to town, and yet the cops in Starling are generally taking a hands-off approach. However, over in Central City, where Barry has not really done anything bad with his powers, I mean, technically he's been acting as a vigilante, but the evidence of any sort of crime, even vigilantism, that the police could actually put together to charge him with something is at best minuscule, and yet Eddie is out there lobbying, trying to get a task force set up to catch the guy. What in the world are you planning to charge him with? I mean, you do have to have evidence, and there's not even conclusive evidence that the Flash even exists. So you have to wonder if it's not just sort of Iris' sort of hero worship of the Flash that is really kind of getting Eddie's goat there. Oh, I should take a moment to mention that we are introduced to the character of Captain Singh this episode. He is a character from the comics, and we don't get to see very much of him. We just seem to get to see that he does mention his boyfriend. And yes, in the comics it is canon that Captain Singh is gay. And that is, of course, going to be touched upon in the future. And this episode, going by Joe's comments, indicates that he's maybe a little bit of one of those bosses that rides his employees a little too hard. But given, of course, that when we do see the captain get angry, it's because Barry, his employee, did just seriously mouth off to him. And, under those circumstances, it would be pretty hard to, for a boss to not be angry. Captain Singh is... I mean, I have seen some stuff with him in the comics. Again, he's sort of a supporting character. They have done some stuff that did focus in on him, but he's not a huge player in the Flash universe. But as I said, we will be seeing more of him based on some casting stuff and whatnot. So anyway, getting back to what I was saying there. What was I saying? Darn, I forgot. Oh yeah, Eddie. So, of course, we see once he's under the power of, influenced by Prism's powers, his jealousy of Eddie has the Flash go after him and whoop the hell out of Eddie and scare Iris half to death. And of course, this sort of attempted murder of a police officer. Well, okay, now the cops have something that they can genuinely hang on the Flash. And of course, this causes Iris to have some be pretty pissed off at Flash and basically say she doesn't want anything more to do with him. Now, I think in that scene, Barry probably should have clarified a little bit beyond a metahuman did that to me. It's more like if he'd said the guy that caused all those people at the bank to fly into a rage and start attacking each other did the same thing to me. I think if he'd been a little bit more specific, it might have helped his case. But again, Iris is basically in a situation where she's seeing somebody that she had really admired basically tried to beat her boyfriend to death right in front of her. So, logic is probably not foremost in her mind at the moment. She's dealing with this situation from an emotional standpoint, which is, of course, perfectly understandable. I think once she's had a little bit of time to process what's happened and think about it on a little bit more, I think she might be much more open to coming back around. Or we can see this sort of trend continue with Iris turning against the Flash, which would certainly be just an enormous knife to Barry's gut, which would make for some really great drama. And let's see. Oh yeah, I absolutely loved Iris's talk with Barry about how like Oliver is on her 3 list. I kind of have to wonder if before he attacked Eddie, if the Flash wasn't on that list as well. And the whole thing was like, Barry, you didn't tell me you knew Oliver Queen. Oh yeah, I'm totally buds with Oliver Queen. Oh man, Felicity was so right. It's like, Barry, you are such a hopeless dork. I mean, I don't think that was exactly what she said, but I think we remember that line because it's so wonderfully true. But that's why we love Barry. I mean, Barry is basically, those you see in comics a lot of stories about sort of nerdy, geeky people who get these powers and then they go off and they become heroes. And I imagine a lot of us who are into these sort of things kind of have had that wish that would happen to us, that we would do the same thing. But, my observations of the way people on the internet act, which in fair concession is not an ideal way to observe human behavior, shows that a lot of people, I think, would probably actually just go off and be petty dicks and get back at people they don't like and all this other stuff. And that's what makes Barry a great hero, is that he genuinely rises above it. He doesn't let the little slights in life, the things that he has, the things he's angry about in his life, he doesn't use his powers to strike out or lash out at people. But this episode, we see what Barry would be like if he did do that. It's been observed that a lot of people who have been bullied in life, if kind of given the opportunity to bully someone else, will take it. Behold the internet as the primary example of that, where, in the mask of anonymity, people just, light shining in through the door there, just go off and be unbelievably horrible to other people, and the internet provides numerous examples of this. So this sort of episode is really kind of that nice highlight of like what would happen if Barry hadn't been such a good person, somebody who was emotionally well adjusted despite the suffering and tragedy that he's had in his life. And stop and think for a moment. Like, what if season 1 Oliver had Barry's powers? Can you imagine? Every single person in that list of book of his dad's would have been dead within 1 day. And then where does he go from there? I mean, Oliver would have just been on a non-stop murder spree, the likes of which had never been seen. And I think that's part of what leads into the whole thing with Oliver, and with Barry accusing Oliver of being jealous of him. And if you just sort of stop and think about that, Barry and Oliver do have some reasons to be jealous with each other. Barry has these amazing powers. Despite, the hardships in his life, Barry has kept an upbeat and positive attitude towards things. He has a family around him. I mean, except for his sister, Oliver's family is all gone. I mean, sure, he has Digg and Roy and stuff, but, that's not, as great as they are, they're not exactly a substitute for the people who've been around him his whole life. His mother, his father, his sister, who, again, she's the only one he still has. Tommy's gone too. Tommy, like, basically the brother that he never had. And, just generally, Barry is a more lighter, more positive person. While, on the other hand, Oliver, until recently, was a billionaire. He was famous. He had Felicity hanging around him and obviously way, way into him. I mean, there's definitely some things on, he lived in a friggin' mansion. We've seen that Barry's apartment is kind of a crap hole. It's not hard to imagine that Barry wasn't a little jealous of Oliver himself. And but anyway, getting back to the characters and stuff. A lot of people have said that's part of the best thing part of this episode was just Digg's reaction to everything, and I totally loved that David Ramsey had even kind of commented that just seeing this whole thing with metahumans and the Flash is completely and utterly freaking Diggle out, because he just looks at this and he's like, how do I deal with that? How could I ever fight something like that? And I mean, that's a perfectly understandable reaction. Remember, Digg is a trained soldier. He's a very experienced military guy, and he's stepped to the plate of dealing with some of the supervillains over in Starling City. But somebody like Barry is just so completely out of his league. I mean, it's sort of like what you or how you or I would react to, trying to fight, I don't know, like Cthulhu or something. And I absolutely love that scene where like Digg is sitting in the car going like, do you think you could go to the bathroom at super speed? Because I have wondered exactly the same thing about the Flash myself. Yeah. Nothing. So that's kind of all I have to say about Digg. Nothing really particular to add about Felicity. So kind of moving into the whole Oliver and Barry situation here. We've kind of talked about the jealousy factor there. Now I do like that Oliver is going in there and really kind of being the no nonsense guy that Barry needs. He's sort of coming in there and being the Slade Wilson to Barry. Barry is like, hey dude, Oliver, great to see you. Come on, let's go team up and take this bad guy down. And Oliver's like, Barry, you need to learn some stuff, and I'm going to make the point to you in a way that I'm going to be absolutely sure it gets through your head. And by that I mean I'm going to shoot you with arrows. So yeah, Oliver's being really hard on Barry, but he's making good points. Barry, like, one of the consistent ways in the comics that people deal with the Flash is they set traps for it, because they know that the Flash may or may not always be able to see these sort of things coming, and that is a smart thing to do. You've seen like motion detectors and covering floors with slippery stuff so that that he can't get any traction, and at various times these have all proven reasonably effective against people with super speed. Yeah, I remember Deathstroke did some crazy thing with motion detectors that he was able to use against Kid Flash. It's like slow him down enough that he literally shot him in the leg with a shotgun, which was pretty intense. But anyway, just kind of getting back to this, that yeah, this basically comes down to Barry is very powerful, but he's inexperienced and doesn't really have that tactical mind. He just sort of rushes in and just sort of overwhelms the bad guys with his powers. While Oliver, being more experienced and not having those powers, has to really think his way around a fight much more. And he does demonstrate quite clearly to Barry that thinking against somebody even as powerful as Barry, as far apart as they are in power, can prove very effective. And again, I just love that whole thing where he shoots Barry, like he's like, I'm going to shoot you with an arrow. And he's like, yeah. And then Barry grabs it, and then he gets shot from behind by 2 arrows. And I kind of went to like, okay, imagine that I wasn't a good guy and that those were bullets. But again, the point was made. Oh man, I've picked a really unfortunate time in terms of glare to record this episode. So, yeah, before I get back to it, one of the things they talk about, the whole thing involving Prism's powers, like color theory. Now, that's a real thing. And there is some evidence that there is something genuine to it. But, of course, not to the degree that we see in this episode. And, of course, we see the lights that get flashed at Barry. Blue and purple and stuff. And basically this sort of ties into the emotional spectrum of the DC universe that is kind of an aspect of the Green Lantern mythos. Of course, one of the people behind Arrow and behind the Flash is Jeff Johns, who's a guy who's basically the most famous writer of Green Lantern for like the last 10 years. I mean, the amount of stuff that this guy has contributed to Green Lantern is phenomenal. I mean, he has really taken under his pen like Green Lantern really became one of those must-read comics. He's done so much good stuff. And one of the ideas he introduced was the idea of the emotional spectrum. And it's that the colors of the rainbow each represent an emotion, and now it's not just the Green Lanterns who have a bunch of people running around with rings who wield power based on that. And of course, there's red for rage, orange for avarice or greed, although there is only the one orange lantern because orange lanterns don't like to share. Yellow for fear, green for willpower. Don't quibble about willpower not being an emotion, okay? Blue for hope, indigo for compassion, and violet for love. Now, I was a little disappointed. We only ever saw Prism use the red power. So, which, of course, orange, avarice really wouldn't have made sense because then everybody else in the bank would have been trying to steal the money. Yellow would have been really cool, though. Just because, introducing fear and stuff. But, hopefully we'll get to see him again and maybe see a little more of his powers. And, yeah, let's see. Is there anything else I want to talk about? Well, oh yeah, I did like how Oliver kind of said that there's something just really off about Harrison Wells. Proof that Oliver has a much better, stronger skill at reading people than anybody than Barry does. And yeah, I kind of think that's everything that I have to say. Again, guys, just so much good stuff in this episode. And then we're going to follow up on all of it in the Arrow episode tonight, which I think is going to be absolutely great. And again, this is just really great to see these two shows come together, these characters bouncing off each other. They're very different tonally. Arrow is much darker, Flash is much more light. But it really does go to show you that you can have these ideas, these groups of characters, these shows that are very different, but that they mesh so well together. And having all of these very disparate kind of storytelling, but being set in the same universe, is one of the great strengths of both Marvel and DC Comics. So, you can really just kind of have your cake and eat it too. And again, that's just one of the things that really, really makes comics fun. And with that said, guys, I'm going to wrap it here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Who's Your Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.